President Obama pledges an unbreakable bond and eternal relationship with Israel. Do Palestinians still think the United States can be an honest broker? In fact, is the US a roadblock to peace? Hello and welcome to The World This Week with me, Phil Rees. 34 years after President Carter brokered a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians at Camp David, the present US leader is once again trying to bring the two sides together. But has US mediation simply allowed Israel to maintain its occupation and colonize Palestinian land? In part two, when is secret intelligence simply a pack of lies? Well, 10 years after the invasion of Iraq, many believe that British and American governments deliberately used duff intelligence to mislead the public. New evidence backs this. Well, we'll find out more in half an hour. But first, US President Barack Obama went to the West Bank city of Ramallah today for talks with Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas. Yesterday, he was in Israel. It was his first visit since taking office. President Obama said that the US is deeply committed to creating a contiguous sovereign state of Palestine. But he seemed to go out of his way to placate Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, with whom relations had been frosty. Here's Alex MacDonald.
Yesterday, Barack Obama touched down in Tel Aviv airport on the first stop of a three-day tour of Israel and the West Bank. The White House has been aiming to lower expectations for this trip, which it assures us is primarily a listening exercise and contains no magic wand for peace in the region. There is little optimism on display from either side in the decades-long Israel-Palestine conflict. A poll published in an Israeli newspaper revealed that only 10% of Israelis think favourably of Obama, while 17% consider themselves actively hateful of him.
The red line, sir. The red line. Okay.
There also can be little love lost with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who backed Obama's presidential rival Mitt Romney in last year's election.
Minutely planned.
In the West Bank, the mood is no more jubilant. Protests have erupted over the American president's visit, with many Palestinians still enraged over America's decision to vote against recognition of Palestine as a non-member observer state at the UN last year.
أوباما لا مرحبا بك ولا أهلا على أرض فلسطين الطاهرة لأننا نحن في أهل فلسطين وأهل غزة لا نريد هذه الزيارة للرئيس أوباما لأن هذه الزيارة لن تجد لنا إلا الخزي والعار.
After the vote, the Israeli government approved the building of 3,000 new settlement homes in the occupied West Bank. The American government has frequently voiced its opposition to settlement building, yet it continues to provide Israel with billions of dollars in aid each year.
The United States was the very first nation to recognize the State of Israel 65 years ago. That's why the Star of David and the Stars and Stripes fly together today. And that is why I'm confident in declaring that our alliance is eternal. It is forever.
Speaking in Ramallah today, President Obama downplayed the relevance of settlements in the conflict.
The core issue right now is how do we get a sovereignty for the Palestinian people and how do we assure security for the Israeli people? And that's the essence of this negotiation. And that's not to say settlements are not important. It is to say that if we solve those two problems, the settlement problem will be solved.
Many view America as holding the balance of power in this conflict. For decades, Israel has been America's strongest ally in the Middle East, and Obama has repeatedly publicly confirmed this. To many, it seems as long as the world's last superpower has Israel's back, there may be no shift in the political landscape. Alex MacDonald, Islam Channel.
With us today, we have Daud Abdullah, the Director of Middle East Monitor. We also have Mattia Toaldo, a fellow at the Institute for the Study of the Americas. And finally, the chief political correspondent for The Independent on Sunday, John Rentoul, joins us as well. Thank you all, gentlemen. Were you surprised, Daud Abdullah, by the sort of friendship that we saw there? They looked like best buddies that had just been reunited. I thought they hated each other.
Well, this is for the cameras. The entire visit is symbolic, more than substantive. Obama has to do this in order to placate his domestic audience. He still faces a tremendous opposition within the Congress. And in order to implement his domestic policies, which, by the way, are his priorities, there is a general acceptance that this administration is more inward-looking And the fact that he's appointed Chuck Hagel as his defense minister was also an indication that the United States would turn in on itself. Hagel was one of those individuals who opposed any form of intervention anywhere.
Well, of course, the Israeli lobby objected to Chuck Hagel's appointment.
And they failed. But the entire visit, you see, he did not go to Israel in his first term. He went to Egypt, he went to Turkey, and he bypassed Israel. So he has to do something on this occasion to show some sort of symbolic appreciation and recognition for that so-called special relationship.
I mean, Toaldo, does that mean, bearing in mind what Daud has just said, does this mean that basically an American president can't really criticize Israel over the long term? I mean, his policy is effectively fixed.
In a way, yes. Given the situation in Congress, given the balance of power between the pro-Israel lobby, there had been attempts 4 years ago to shift the balance within the pro-Israel lobby with the creation of J Street, which was a more liberal
Israeli lobby group
branch of the pro-Israel lobby. That has basically failed until now. There is, of course, a generational shift within the Jewish community, but now today the pro-Israeli lobby is not really a Jewish lobby in it, literally. It's more a right-wing lobby in favor of a right-wing government in Israel. And Obama has decided a few years ago that he doesn't want to pick a fight with this lobby because he's already picking many fights on domestic policy. So he basically decided that domestic policy is his priority, that within foreign policy, the Middle East is not really his priority. And we shouldn't forget that the U.S. is increasingly less relying on Middle Eastern oil, also in energy terms. And so the Middle East will be less and less important. There will be more emphasis on aspects of the Middle East which are not closely related to Israel-Palestine.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, the broader picture, which perhaps we'll talk to later. But, I mean, John Rentoul, were you surprised that Obama didn't actually demand a freeze on settlements, which, I mean, of course, he did in his first term? He seemed to say, well, fair enough, settlements are going to happen now. I mean, that was almost a green light to them, wasn't it?
Almost. Yeah, I mean, you know, Mattia's quite right and Daud's quite right that you know, Barack Obama's main focus is on his domestic audience. You know, people might have assumed that because he doesn't have to be re-elected, therefore he would be freer to take a more sort of tough posture towards
the lobby, that he didn't need their help for re-election in that sense.
Well, yes, but he still does want to achieve things domestically, and he still wants to get things through Congress, and therefore he can't afford to alienate public opinion or Congress. So you could see what his calculation is, and he's a clever president. He understands foreign affairs possibly better than most of his predecessors. And the lesson for an American president, if you understand foreign affairs, is don't get involved, because you know that kind of stuff, intervention abroad, just leads to trouble. I mean, you know, we've had the 10th anniversary of Iraq and seen the damage that did to George W. Bush.
But there's another aspect to this, in the sense that Obama, in his second term, about 68% of American Jews voted for him. So he still enjoys a tremendous support among American Jewish community. Yes, you know, the more extreme elements of the lobby, the AIPAC and the Anti-Defamation League, those hardcore, you know, Zionists, they are, you know, rabidly opposed to him. But on the whole, he still enjoys the support of American Jews, and he has to take that into consideration as he goes forward during this term.
I mean, John Rentoul, what I was going to come to with you, in a sense, was this whole issue of, you know, is America actually important there? Because, you know, everybody seems to look to the United States, following Camp David, as if they are central to any peace deal. And obviously there was the Camp David Part 2, as it were, in 2000 as well, that Bill Clinton was involved in. I mean, why should anybody look to America to actually sort anything out there?
Well, because America obviously is very, very important, and the relationship between America and Israel is extremely important. But you know, the most important thing is Israeli public opinion, and we've seen where Israeli public opinion lies in the recent elections there. I mean, unless you can persuade the Israeli population that they should do a deal with the Palestinians, then you can put as much pressure as you like through America, but you're not going to make much progress. And maybe, perhaps we shouldn't be too cynical about Barack Obama. I mean, it may be that the way to persuade Israeli opinion is not to take too hard a line on settlements, but to work more softly. I mean, that may sound diplomatically naive, but it may not be the stupid way of trying to persuade hardline Israeli public opinion.
Daud, would you accept that? I mean, after all, Israel tends to respond like, after all, there's a UN recognition of Palestine vote, and then they instantly say after that we're going to build 3,000 homes. So they tend to want to be have a big stick, don't they?
Exactly. I think that the problem of the settlements, really exposes the fallacy of this, two-state solution, that it is viable, that it is, something that can actually be implemented as things stand. We're speaking about a territory that has been so carved up, by these bypass roads, by the settlements, and the creation of the Bantustans, the cantons, independent, enclaves within the West Bank. That it's really a pipe dream to speak about a geographic, continuous, piece of territory whereby you can establish a state. It's really a platitude given by the Americans and the international community to the Palestinians. But the crux of the matter in all of this is the fact that the Americans have monopolized the whole process. There is something called the quartet, but where are the other members? Where are the Russians in this? Where is the United Nations? Where are the Europeans? We have Congress 2 days ago threatening the Palestinians. If you ever attempt to prosecute the Israelis for these illegal settlements, then we cut the aid. You see, a straight case of blackmail, and so the Palestinians would have to continue to go along with the expansion of settlements in order to get the salaries for their workers every month.
I mean, Mattia, isn't this point really the fundamental point that perhaps Daud is getting at there, the very important one, that there's a kind of ritual taking place now. There's the Americans are serenading with these different people year after year. Meanwhile, the prospect of the Palestinian state actually just is slowly disappearing for the reasons we've heard, the security roads, the West Bank of the Jordan River, all of these areas that have been taken away, and that actually Israel is simply growing and taking Palestinian land. And that actually is the only thing that explains what's going on now.
I think if you look at the region now, the interesting thing is that the West Bank is one of the most stable Arab lands in this moment. Look at Lebanon. Don't just look at Syria and Egypt, which are, of course, obvious candidates for instability, but look also at Lebanon or Jordan. What's the situation there? If you look at the West Bank, on the other hand, it's a fairly stable place.
Well, it doesn't have democracy, though. I mean, that's perhaps...
I know, that's another story, but... it's a fairly stable place, according to American and Israeli policymakers. And, the threats from Congress about withdrawing U.S. aid to the Palestinian Authority, that's just threats. It's mainly in the American and in the Israeli interest that the Palestinian Authority continues its security cooperation with the Israeli security services. And I think that's not going to be withdrawn. And I think that whatever Americans can do to keep the current status quo stable, they will do it.
Yeah, but I mean, the Palestinian Authority is speaking about there. I mean, many people, see them as collaborators in the occupation, and necessary collaborators in that sense.
They are the only losers from the current situation, but who cares about the Palestinians? This is something we should ask ourselves. Of course, American policymakers do not take them into account. They have never taken them into account, probably. But are we Europeans really taking the Palestinians into account? Are we supporting the status quo or not? If you look at donor aid to the Palestinian Authority, it comes greatly from the European Union to do things that in most cases should be done by the occupier. So in a way, we're subsidizing the Israeli occupation. This is something that we should start asking ourselves. Are we spending the money on the right policies? Are we really so irrelevant in keeping the status quo alive? I think in this moment we shouldn't expect much from the Americans, which have a lot to lose and very little to gain from commitment on this dossier, while we should start asking ourselves in Europe, what can we do to change?
Well, should one draw a line under American involvement as an honest broker and say, look, they give $4 billion a year to support Israel, they will never be an honest broker? Should that be assumed now? And there shouldn't be Mahmoud Abbas pleading with the Americans. I mean, I know he hasn't done on this trip, but in the past, that was the chorus we heard from the Palestinians, all kind of looking for the Americans to kind of control Israel. Should that kind of dynamic now be said, it doesn't work?
Well, that dynamic has already changed. The Obama administration had done everything to stop the Palestinians from using the UN. They have gone to the UN. The problem is whether the Palestinians find other honest brokers in the world. Are the Europeans playing as honest brokers? I'm not sure.
Well, John Rentoul, what do you think? Do you think the European... I mean, Tony Blair is obviously still involved. I'm not sure whether he's American or not. No, but, you know, he's still there. And you know, Britain...
He's trying to be an honest broker, but, you know, he is calculated, just as Obama has done, that you're not going to achieve any change except by persuading the Israelis, and so therefore he takes what to Palestinians must seem like a pro-Israeli position. But those are the facts. I mean, the situation. I mean, let's be completely blunt about this. The situation in Israel-Palestine is very, very gloomy. There were opportunities for a peace settlement many years ago. Those opportunities look extremely slight now. But the only possible solution is a two-state solution. That was something that America didn't want to agree to. That George Bush was persuaded to publish the roadmap. The Israelis didn't want it. So it is possible to move to get the Israelis and the Americans to move, but it is very, very difficult.
But I mean, why doesn't it, you know, you say that it depends on Israeli public opinion. Well, are you saying that the world is, you know, Israel can simply have a veto on anything, that they can't be stopped? I mean, what about sanctions? You know, there could be active policies to try to make Israel change its policy on occupation. I mean, why doesn't anybody support that?
Because that's not likely to have a productive effect, is it? I mean, any kind of sanctions against Israel are likely to provoke a deeper retreat into right-wing greater Israeli.
Well, sanctions
ideology.
are applied against South Africa. They're applied against Iran to try to change policy. I mean, why not Israel?
Because well, you've got to ask whether sanctions would work. I mean. Maybe you would come to that conclusion on the basis that nothing else has worked, but I think sanctions would make things worse.
I mean, Daud, do you think that anything can be done then, or is John Rentoul right in a way that, you know, Israel public opinion is the defining actor in this, and until they're persuaded otherwise, nothing can be done?
I think, first of all, we have to break the dependency and the monopoly of the United States in the entire process. Yes, they have a strategic alliance with the Israelis. They are no longer, honest brokers, but they are international actors. We have the United Nations. Let's remember that this conflict, this problem was created by the international community. In the first place, it was the UN that decided to partition Palestine against the will of the Palestinian people. So they have a moral responsibility, a historic responsibility to be involved, to find a solution to this, and not to leave it entirely up to the United States, which has proven to be, dishonest from the very beginning. Now, when we speak about the questions of sanctions, it is already being contemplated in Europe. The Europeans are saying, well, we're going to, scrutinize very carefully your settlement products when it comes to Europe, and such products will not be, given any preferential treatment. That is the way forward. But I want to go to something that John mentioned about the two-state solution, because even Israeli officials, even Ehud Barak himself, is saying that, the present realities do not allow for, a two-state solution. Ehud Barak himself is saying that we're heading towards a binational state in historic Palestine. So, we should not just give lip service to something that we know full well is not going to work.
I mean, is that, Mattia, I mean, what's your perspective of all of that then? And the problem that Israel will face in terms of demographics if the status quo continues, and it's questions that have already been brought up by some politicians of annexing part of the West Bank?
I think in the long run, Israel might be the big loser of the status quo. What if one day, not far away from today, Palestinians start to say, okay, we don't have a two-state solution. We'll never have a state of our own because in the Israeli ruling coalition...
Daud is saying that now.
Yeah. And from that day on, the Palestinians asked just for civil rights in Israel. They asked to have property rights, freedom of movement, not even voting rights, but just the basic civil rights. What impact would this policy have, for example, on the American public? How much framing their struggle as a civil rights movement would change the way most of the American public sees the issue? I'm afraid that still the Palestinians are not ready for this because, of course, this would mean that in the short term you basically give up on having your own state. But the hard truth is that the Palestinian state has been killed in the past 15 years. And if you have a tour of the West Bank today, you have the clear sensation that it's going to be very hard to have a Palestinian state, because not just because of the settlements, but it's because of all the infrastructure that Israel has built. And speaking about sanctions that you mentioned before, I think that more effective on the European side would be a day-to-day pressure on the Israelis on what happens in Area C of the West Bank, the area which is 60% of the West Bank and is completely under Israeli control. And that's the area where European day-to-day pressure, controls, on-site visits, pressures on the Israelis to guarantee basic human rights to the Palestinians. That's where we can be more effective.
I mean, the point is, John, we're coming to the end there, that the present situation actually suits the Israelis, doesn't it? They can continue growing and, you know...
Well, except what Mattia was saying was, you know, in the long run, it's possible that the Israelis are just storing up more and more trouble for themselves, because if they have a large Palestinian population for which they are responsible and to which they are not reconciled, then you can see how things might become much more difficult, and the Palestinians might go back to serious violence, and you would then have a very difficult problem. But certainly you're right that at the moment Israeli public opinion is not persuaded that it is in its interest to reach some accommodation with the Palestinians.
We're coming to the end. No, please go ahead.
If I can chip in, the real threat, I think, is not really the Palestinians going back to terrorism. I think the real threat for the Israelis and also for the West is one day the Palestinian Authority will not be a viable instrument anymore for fiscal reasons and for other political reasons, because they will realize they're actually cooperating in the occupation. What happens if the Palestinian Authority is dissolved? Or what happens if the security cooperation with the Israelis is dissolved? Would that mean that the Israeli army would have to go back into Palestinian cities at a moment in which the domestic debate in Israel is all about sharing the burden of military service? Would that create a serious crisis within Israel? I think so.
All right, well, we're coming to an end now. Thank you all, gentlemen, for this debate. I mean, it was a little bit gloomy, I think, watching Obama and Netanyahu and goings on there, but we can all hope that things can only get better. Well, thank you to everyone. In part 2, did Tony Blair lie to the public before the invasion of Iraq, or was he simply misinformed about WMDs? Well, we'll find out more in a few minutes. Stay with us.